Hello and welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. I first heard this week's guest sharing his incredible story on Catherine Fairweather's Voices from the Frontline podcast and knew I'd love to meet him. Giles Duley is many things, a photographer whose work tells intimate stories on the long-term humanitarian impact of conflict. He's a writer, accomplished chef, CEO and founder of the Legacy of War Foundation, and he's travelled extensively in Iraq, South Sudan, the Congo, Angola, Bangladesh, Ukraine, and many other war-torn countries, using his photography to try to create change. Giles started out in fashion and music, photographing bands like Oasis, Lenny Kravitz and Mariah Carey for magazines including Vogue. His portrait of Marilyn Manson was voted one of the best 100 rock photographs of all time. In 2011, whilst on assignment in Afghanistan, Giles was severely injured in an IED explosion when photographing a US regiment. He was lucky to survive, but lost both legs and an arm. Understandably, a dark period followed. 46 days in hospital, countless operations, trapped at one point in his own mind, only able to blink to communicate. And then perhaps the hardest blow of all, the phone not ringing. But he's refused to allow the challenges and difficulties of being a triple amputee to stop him at making a difference. And in many ways, perhaps it's driven him harder, returning to work in Afghanistan the following year and now running his extraordinary NGO. Today, he joins me from Kyiv in Ukraine, where he's working with his charity. Giles, it's a real privilege to speak to you. I know you're out on the road. Tell me a bit about what you're doing at the moment in Ukraine.
Hey, Helen. Thanks for having me on the podcast. A lot of things in Ukraine. Actually, I have a long history with Ukraine. I first came here in 2010. So it was actually one of my first projects documenting the lives of street kids in Odessa. And then I returned in 2015 with the Russian invasion. And then 2.5 years ago now with the full-scale invasion, started working here with my NGO. So I have quite a different layers of work here, both as a photographer, documenting the impact of the war. So I'm working on what I call the Ukraine Photo Diary, which is actually a 4-year project, which is looking at war through a different lens. Often we see imagery of front lines, of war zones, of soldiers fighting. My work is always trying to reflect the sort of full spectrum of society. And in fact, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, a friend of mine, Klopotenko, who's a very well-known chef here, we sat down and he said, as a chef, he felt guilty that when he thought of Iraq, of Syria, Afghanistan, all he could think of was war. All he could think and conjure in his mind was the conflict, was the brutality of destroyed buildings, injured people screaming on the streets. As a chef, he goes, I don't know anything about their food culture, and I feel guilty for that now that my country is in the same situation. And he said to me, promise me you won't show Ukraine in that way. So that's been what I've been working on for a long time is, yes, there are some imagery from the trenches, from the front line, but it's also somebody practicing ballet at the Lviv Opera. It's a chef working in Kyiv. It's Odessa, people fishing on the seafront. It's a reflection of life in its many layers because, in a sense, they're all war photographs. They're all people impacted by the conflict, all people under threat of the war, all people have relatives lost or on the front lines. So for me, war is like this mosaic of different stories. So that's one of the projects I'm working on. And then at the same time, my foundation's here working. We have ambulances on the front lines doing evacuations, mainly for the elderly, people with disability. And we've also started a project training injured Ukrainian soldiers who have maybe lost limbs, amputees themselves, or in wheelchairs to become prosthetic technicians. Because it's one of the things that I've learned in my 25 years of covering conflict, that often there's a lot of funding from international organizations during the crisis point, but in the years afterwards, that funding disappears. And when you have a young child, for example, who's lost a limb, you have 60 years of care that they will need. So you have to build the capacity within the country to support that. So what we're doing is giving jobs to those who are injured, who need retraining, but at the same time, building capacity within the country for prosthetic care. Sorry, that was a long rambling answer to your question.
No, not at all. But it raises so many questions for me. But do people, perhaps children who have lost limbs and the elderly and disabled, I suppose being over here, we never really think about what life holds for them. And they've got all those additional challenges to face. In your situation now, you perhaps have an even greater understanding of the challenges that they face.
Even before my own injury, my work was under the title Legacy of War. So I was always interested in the long-term impact of conflict because for most civilians and soldiers, war does not end with a peace treaty. Look at Vietnam, for example. 160,000 people have been injured by unexploded bombs since the war ended. There are people still being born with the effects of Agent Orange, the contamination of the land. There are still people with deep psychological trauma from the war, both in Vietnam and in America. Using that as one example, you can see 50, 60 years after a war, people are still deeply impacted. So I was really interested in the long-term impact of war before my own injury. But of course, having gone through it myself, that does give me maybe a better window into understanding that. But as I say, Legacy of War was also about looking at common themes through conflicts. So I would go to Syria and I would hear a story. And if I shut my eyes, I think that's the same story I've heard in Cambodia or I've heard in Sudan. And so you start to realize that actually we look at wars as single events. I try and look at them as the themes that run across them. And what can we learn from those? What can we learn from the mistakes? For example, I was in Bosnia and Herzegovina recently and seeing the impact of the war that's 30 years ago now, looking at how people are still impacted by landmines, by disability, by psychological trauma, and seeing, okay, what can we learn from that? How can we make sure that doesn't happen in another conflict? So for me, it's all these things mesh into one. So yes, my own story has impacted how I see it, but I was doing this work, which is why I got injured.
Yes, of course, because you were out on the battlefield when you did get injured. And I think your NGO, by the sounds of it, runs very differently to a lot of other NGOs. I like the way that you just mentioned you're training victims of the war to be prosthetists, counsellors, physiotherapists. You're enabling people to help themselves. And I would imagine that would be really empowering when everything around you has been taken away.
I think one thing I learned a lot about, and I'm sure we'll come back on it, but in my own recovery, I spent a lot of time in hospital with time to reflect. And actually a word that I think is a really interesting word that gets used a lot by NGOs and UN organizations is empowerment. And you will hear a lot of organizations saying, we empower women, we empower children, we empower those with disabilities. I learned during my own recovery, you can't empower someone else. And actually what you have to do is break down the barriers that stop people empowering themselves. So when I was in hospital, I was surrounded by amazing doctors, physiotherapists, nurses, occupational therapists, all this amazing team, my family, but none of them empowered me to walk again. They facilitated it and they supported it and they encouraged it. But I was the one that would have to get up on those days when everything was hurting and put the prosthetics on, the bleeding, the pain that you were in, to push myself to walk. And so I realized that if I was going to work with my own foundation, we'd have to see things that way. So rather than ever thinking we're going to empower someone, what we're doing is talking to them and saying, okay, what are the barriers? What's holding you back from achieving what you feel is your potential? What is it that's holding you back from fulfilling your dreams and ambitions? And then we break down those barriers. And it's probably easiest to give you an example of actually what is I probably shouldn't have a favorite project, but I do. And it's called Land for Women in Rwanda. And Land for Women began over a conversation with this amazing woman called Olive. It's hard to summarize her story, but in brief, 30 years ago, because it's 30 years ago this year, at the beginning of the genocide in Rwanda, she had actually gone to hospital to give birth to her third child. It was a small hospital being run by nuns. And as she's giving birth, the news comes over the radio about what's happening. It's the start of the genocide. Now, Olive herself was Tutsi and her best friend, Clementine, was Hutu. And Clementine says, I'm going to go back. I'm going to make sure everybody's safe in the village. Obviously, you've got to stay here as you're giving birth, but I will make sure everyone's okay. But actually, by the time she got back, the village had been attacked and everybody had been killed. So Olive's two other children, her husband, her parents, had all been massacred. She was giving birth to her third child. There's something quite powerful in the idea that in that moment of life, everybody that was close to her was killed. The small hospital that she was working in was surrounded by militias who were threatening to take away the remaining Tutsis. And the nun said, look, we can't protect you any longer. And the militias came in and started dragging everyone away. Now, Olive made a decision that she says she regrets, but really it was any decision she could make. She left her baby because the baby had no identity papers, so nobody would know if it was Tutsi or Hutu. She was dragged away. She was taken to a marketplace where I think about 2,000 people were slaughtered that day. She was one of only 3 survivors by hiding under other bodies. She then went and hid in a riverbed. And then over the next 100 days of the genocide, she would spend the day in the river with just her eyes above, keeping undercover under a bridge. Then during the night, she would sleep on the riverbank. And by the time the genocide was over and the area was liberated, she was so sick. She had insects that had burrowed into her skin. She had malaria and various other diseases. She was taken to hospital. She spent a couple of months there recovering. And then she went back to her village to bury her family. But by the time she returned to her village, it was now probably 6 months after the genocide. Nobody knew where the bodies were. the village was in ruins. But she did find 6 babies that she adopted. And she then moved to Kigali. Now, I should say the next bit of this story, Olive has given me permission to share. It's something she's asked me to share, but it's a very difficult part of her story because she had no family to support her, no education, no other way of working, and she was forced into sex work. She was forced into prostitution to fund and supply and look after these 6 adopted children. Now, she did not realize that was fueled in many ways by survivor guilt and her own PTSD. She described it to me that each person that had sex with her, she felt she deserved it, that she was a dustbin and that they were almost like the perpetrators of the crime and she deserved this. And for the next 6 years, that's how she lived her life. And there's part of the story that she was taking a lot of alcohol and drugs and really was in a very dark place. But then she started getting some small psychological help. And she started to understand that she had been blaming herself for the loss of her children and her family. And that actually, if she was going to help the 6 children she'd adopted, she was going to have to return to her village and return to the life that she had before the genocide. So she returned to her village. But when she was there, it's now 6-7 years after the genocide, some of those involved in the crimes against her family had been released or amnesty. And so as she was taking the children to school or going to the market, she would see the people that had killed her family. And again, she said this was eating her up inside and she was struggling with it. And then she made a remarkable decision. And again, it's another word that has a lot of meanings to a lot of different people. But Olive made a decision where she decided to forgive all of those that had done the crimes. And one by one, she would go to their houses and forgive them for what they did. Now, in her mind, it released her from their kind of curse, the pain that they had over her. And she said that she would come home and she'd find things had been fixed in her house. Maybe the garden had been worked on. And obviously these men had come, were in their own way trying to get forgiveness by doing work on her house. Then one night there was a knock on her door and she always describes it in a very cinematic way. It was raining, it was dark. And when she opened the door, it was the leader of the militia that had ordered the killing. And he had avoided some of the crimes. And actually Olive was one of the few witnesses to his crimes. And she'd actually refused to testify against him for various reasons. So she was now terrified that he'd come to silence her. But he actually said, no, I've heard what you've done, and I would like to take you to where we buried the families, where we buried your family. So now it's 10 years after the genocide, she was led to a wood, and when the government came, they found about 150 bodies in this unmarked grave. So in Olive's words, her forgiveness meant the whole village was finally able to lay their ghosts to rest. And there's actually a very beautiful coda to the story that when she was working in Kigali, her friend Clementine, who had left the country as well, fearing reprisals at the end of the genocide, came and found her. And Clementine's there on Olive's door about 5 years after the genocide saying, I thought you were dead. You were like my sister just because we were different by our tribe. We brought up together. We were sisters. So they hugged. And then she said, but I had to find you, Olive, because I have your son.
Oh my goodness.
And found the baby and brought up Jonathan as her own. And then Jonathan was returned to Olive.
Oh my goodness. And are you working in Rwanda and helping people like Olive there?
Sorry, again, I'm giving very long, rambling answers. But everything for me begins with a story. And so it starts with Olive's story. And then me and Olive have become very good friends. And I have to say, it was actually when I was doing the interview with her, I realized it was her birthday the next day. And she'd never had a birthday. She'd never celebrated her birthday. So I turned up the next day with a cake and quite a few beers. Community got together and we had a big celebration for her birthday. And we've become very dear friends, very close. And one day I asked that simple question. What can I do to help? What can I do to support you? And this is really why I was using her example, is because there was no way that me, a guy from South London, a white guy from South London, was empowering Olive. Olive is as strong as you get. She is as resilient. She is this incredible powerhouse of a person. So I can't empower her, but what I can do is understand what was holding her back from that self-empowerment. And so she had a small cooperative and they grew potatoes, but due to the fact they were renting land, that they were seen as the lowest of the low, that the marketers would take money off them, they wouldn't really get much money, she was struggling. And so we sat down and we came up for this idea for this project called Land for Women. And it's a very simple concept where we work with cooperatives of women, nothing unique in that, but we help them through 5 years of education. So they learn climate smart farming, they learn banking, but they also get social psychological support. They get all these kind of other parts of a kind of holistic approach to building their education. But what is unique is we buy the land and then we transfer that land ownership to the women. So they have the power. They can actually tell us to leave at any time. They are the landowners, not us. And we wanted to change that kind of colonial approach to NGOs, truly put power in the hands of the women in the farms And then we have to prove to them that our project is worth their time. We have to prove to them that it's worth them working with us. But as I say, at any time, they can tell us to leave. What we really were trying to say is that somebody like Olive, I can't empower her, but there was two barriers, land ownership and education, that were stopping her from self-empowerment. Now, 5 years later, we have 5-6 farms. We're looking to do more. And it is a joy to see these women flourish, become business leaders. We had their conference yesterday, where they have a big conference now in Kigali, in this kind of big conference center in the middle of the city. It's a festival where other business leaders comes. The women themselves now, from some of the earliest farms, have now got other businesses. They're renting out motorbikes and doing all sorts of things. They're entrepreneurs. And that all came because of them. We just broke down the barriers. So that's what we try and do as an organization, is look at people's challenges. And again, as somebody with a disability myself, I would tell you that people with disability are often the most resilient, most resourceful. They've had to fight their whole life, but they're held back by society's barriers and by the infrastructure around them. So if you can correct that, then people flourish naturally on their own.
In the horror of war, and you've seen more than most people ever experience in a lifetime, you always seem to find some special, simple, poignant moments. And often that does involve food, and you'll share a meal. And I would imagine those simple pleasures are really important against such a cruel and a harsh backdrop of conflict. How has food and sharing a meal, Giles, helped you to really connect to people and perhaps understand what it is that they need, that you can help give to improve their lives when they're suffering in ways that many of us will never be able to really, truly understand, I think?
Food works for me on quite a few different layers. Food is in my DNA. For a start, my dad's family were Italian, so I think that gives you food in your DNA. I always joke that Italy is the one place where you can get in a taxi journey from the airport. Within 5 minutes, you're having an argument with the taxi driver about where the best tomatoes come from. You know, the passion for food is deep in the blood. And then my mother, who's no longer with us, but her story is very interesting. She had me quite late in life. And actually, she was a proper Cockney. And in the 1930s was sent away, I think at 14 years old, to become a servant in a stately home in the kitchens. And so from the age of 14 until 18, she basically worked as a scullery maid and then a kitchen assistant and then the cook in a stately home. So I grew up with everything being made by hand, suet puddings, roly-poly, making your own bread. Everything was handmade, everything was reused. But I never really appreciated how much had been taught to me by osmosis, by just being around my mother. But then many years later, I was in Mosul in 2017, and that was some of the worst fighting I'd seen, and it was a quite traumatic experience. And I came back, and quite often when I come home, it's the struggle of coming from a place where people are going through such hardships, and then suddenly you're back in what we would call the normalcy of life in London, and it's hard to balance the two. So quite often I would kind of shut myself off for a few days as I decompress. But this time I was really struggling, and I just couldn't find any peace. And for me, if I sit and watch a film or read a book, my mind is still racing. But I started cooking, and I realized that when I was making pasta, when I was making bread, really deep cooking, it was the one thing that would take my mind off all the horrors that were going on in there. And so it became my therapy. It became my way to switch off. I mean, I have to say, after that particular trip, I think all my neighbors were loving me because I was cooking at 4 o'clock in the morning and leaving cakes outside their doors because I had way more food than I can eat. But I realized there that food was my therapy. It's the yin and yang, where war is hatred, war is destruction. Food is about bringing people together in love. And so that became my balance. And then at the same time, I realized that it was a great way to build relationships with people. People say to me, how do you choose the people that you photograph? And my answer is, how do you choose your friends? I don't treat it any differently than if I was to start a new job or when you start school. You don't make a list of requirements for who you're going to become friends with. It's just instinctual. And then what do we do when we meet somebody that we like? What's the difference between an acquaintance and a friend? For me, it's a shared meal. When you meet somebody you're attracted to, you ask them out for dinner. When you see your family again, we sit around a table at a funeral or a wedding. We celebrate through food. So I thought this should be the way that I build up relationships. Rather than turn up and say, I'm a photographer, I would turn up and say, I would love to come and cook with you. And I realized it completely changed the dynamic of how I built relationships. And in fact, Mosul, again, there was a really interesting example of one of the worst stories, really, I think I've ever had to document, was a family that was living in the front lines between ISIS and the Iraqi government. And they'd been under ISIS rule for a couple of years as well. So they dealt with all the brutalities of that. But they were stuck in this house, so they couldn't really escape. When I went to visit them, the fighting had left the area, but the father of the family had been on the roof and he'd been killed by a drone strike. The grandfather had been in the garden when a mortar round landed near him and killed him. And then I think worst of all was the mother had been shot by a sniper in the kitchen, and it had taken her 3 days to die on the kitchen floor because they couldn't get her out. It was just the grandmother and 3 grandchildren left in this house that looked like a film set from a sort of Tom Hanks war movie of bullet holes in the walls and burnt like fans in the ceiling or melted. It was really a horrific scene. And when I turned up, the grandmother was just screaming at me about the horrific things that had happened. And I was trying to calm her down and say, she didn't need to tell me all of this. I just came to visit. But she carried on. And so I asked my translator if she would sit down for a moment. And she sat down. I said, look, I'll be honest. I said, my grandmother was Italian. She taught me to cook, but she's no longer with us. I said, I need a new grandmother to teach me to cook. And you can see this woman doing a double take going, why the hell has this one-armed bloke come halfway around the world to a war zone to cook? She's looking very confused. But I said, look, I just have one request. Can I come back tomorrow and we cook together? And for the first time, you could see her kind of calm down. And she said, okay. So I went back the next day. All I could find was a frozen chicken and some rice because obviously we're right at the front lines. And it turned out actually she was the worst cook. She was terrible.
Oh, no.
And we spent the first hour with this kind of frozen chicken, hitting it with a hammer. There was chicken shrapnel flying around because we were trying to get it in the pot. But we were there with the grandkids and there was laughter and we cooked. And we spent the day making a meal and then we sat down, we shared that meal together. And actually, as we were having the meal, one of her other sons, who hadn't seen her for 2 or 3 years, arrived and burst into tears to see his mother sitting there sharing a meal and in that moment of calm. And that's again when I decided that's how I would always approach my storytelling, is to say to people, let's just share a meal. Sometimes photographs don't come out of it. Sometimes stories don't. But it's a sign, I think, of respect. It's a sign of saying that I really want to sit here as an equal and share a meal. And then stories come from that. So that sort of food has become sort of intrinsic in everything I do. And so again, I approach it the same with the foundation. When I'm meeting a new community that we're going to work with, I don't turn up and say, look, I have this idea. We think you should do this, or we're going to build a well, or we're going to build a school. No, I say, let's have a meal. Let's sit down. Let's chat. And you tell me what it is that you need. What is it that you need our support in, and how can we find a way? All the projects we do, we try and make them self-funding within 5 years. It's all, as I say, about training, about assets. We make sure that all the funds we raise go to those communities. We have no international staff. We have no offices. Everything is about building those communities so that they can be self-sustaining, because that's exactly what happened for me. Nobody taught me to go through the pain of walking cane. They provided the prosthetic legs. They provided the physiotherapy. They did the surgeries, but it had to come from within me, and I had to ask for what I needed. And that's what we try and do as an international NGO.
You always say you're not a war photographer, and you're not a war photographer. You're a storyteller and you're a humanitarian. And you, for me, make it much easier to understand or to comprehend what people are going through, because you're telling intimate stories. And I think sometimes conflicts like Ukraine and in Israel and Palestine, I think people here in the West who haven't experienced the sorts of conflicts that you have, we find it all overwhelming and too big to get our minds around. But when I see your work, it just rips my heart out. And you bring home what's really happening to people whose lives are devastated by all of this.
That's the one thing I've learned. I've worked in Palestine, Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and there's this common thread through all of it, which is the families just want to get on with their lives. Every family has the same hopes and dreams, really. They want their kids to go safely to school. They want their loved ones to be protected and safe. They want to be able to work, to provide for their families. And I find this a kind of universal truth, whether I'm in a mud hut in South Sudan, whether I'm in a tent in Jordan or a flat in Brixton. The basic needs and desires and dreams of families are the same. And so those are the stories that I'm interested in sharing. One of the big turning points for me, I was a fashion photographer when 9/11 happened. And I remember I was in the middle of a fashion shoot, suddenly seeing the horror of what was happening in America. But then I started to see what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I thought, no, I don't really understand what it's like for the people there. I'm seeing the war. I'm seeing all these kind of big images of big explosions and tanks and fighter jets over Baghdad. But who are the Iraqis? Who are the Afghans? What's their life like? And that was really one of the driving forces for me to start doing the work that I do, is that I wanted to tell the stories of civilians, of everyday people caught up in conflict. I grew up reading the history of World War I, of World War II. It was all about men fighting wars. It was about generals. I could give you a list of men's names from World War II. I don't think I could name women from World War II because that wasn't what I was taught. And so I wanted to know, what's the stories of women? What's the stories of families? What's the stories of civilians? In World War I think it's something like 90% of actual casualties from explosive weapons was men fighting soldiers. Now it's pretty much flipped, where it's probably 90% of casualties are civilians. And yet we still focus on those fighting the wars because that gives you the exciting images that are going to be on the covers of New York Times or Guardian. It's going to be explosions of soldiers, etc. That to me was not the story that I wanted to understand.
And was that the turning point? Because it sounded like you had quite an intoxicating career in music and fashion. And you mentioned that your Marilyn Manson photograph is named as one of the top 100 rock photographs of all time. I would imagine life was quite exciting and dynamic, having worked in that kind of showbiz entertainment world. Was it really 9/11 that was that turning point that made you move away from that kind of world?
I think it was a combination of things. I was 18, 19 when I started working as a photographer, soon after I got given a camera. I didn't really know what I was doing. In fact, I was telling somebody this story just yesterday about how I blagged my way. I was trying to explain to a Ukrainian what the word blagged means, but I used to sit in the lift or stand in the lift at EMAP, which was the big publishing house that had Q Magazine and Select and the magazines I wanted to work for. And I would wait for this picture editor called Simon Vinyl to get in the lift. And then once he came in the lift, I turned to him and said, "All right, Simon, how's it going? I'm just popping to this other magazine. I just got back from New York. Should I pop in and see you?" And he looked at me a bit puzzled, but then just thought, "Oh, yeah, sure, mate. Yeah, come in." I had no experience, no work. I was completely making it up. I lied that my portfolio was in New York. I had a couple of photographs with me of friends, and it was enough to get my first job.
Wow.
Then I'm on the road. I remember then, I think my second shoot was the Black Crowes in Detroit. And it was a bit like that film, Almost Famous. I'm like a 19-year-old in the back of this massive tour bus with this, at the time, Black Crowes, one of the biggest rock and roll bands in the States. And I remember the bass player was drinking a bottle of Jack Daniels from the bottle. And he looked at me and he said, "Do you want a whiskey?" And I thought, "Yeah, please," thinking I'll get like a little glass of whiskey. And he just reached down, picked up another bottle and passed that to me. And I just thought, wow, this is my job now. This is pretty cool. So it was, and it was great. I loved that. And it was also an amazing time because mid-90s in London, it was a time of Oasis, Blur, Prodigy, all these amazing bands, Pulp. It was a very exciting time for music. And I think the last hurrah in some ways of music photography, because magazines were still relevant. It was before the internet. So if you want to know about a band, you had to go and buy a magazine. You looked at photo spreads. I remember like buying records simply because you went on a review of it. So it was a really great time to be involved with it. But then as the years went on, there was a kind of change in the culture. It became a lot more about celebrity culture. At the time, then a Big Brother. FHM was suddenly selling 1 million copies a month because they had semi-naked celebrities on the front. Everything changed, and I didn't like it. I didn't like the world of portraiture because suddenly I'm photographing people that really had nothing to say, that they were hyped up, and it felt very empty. And I didn't like the way that women were portrayed in a lot of the magazines I was working for. And it actually came to a climax. I was doing a shoot at the Charlotte Street Hotel, and there was a young actress who had actually been in Big Brother, and now she was being shouted at by her agent and the editor of a magazine because she wouldn't take her top off. And they were saying you'd agreed to do that. And why the hell would we photograph you if you're not going to do that? Because nobody gives a shit who you are. It was a really horrible scene. And I was sat in the other room and I was watching that. And it was that kind of eureka moment where you just go, this is not what I set out to do. I'm a portrait photographer at my heart, whether it be conflicts, fashion, whatever. I'm interested in people. And to see this young person in tears, say young, probably the same age as me at the time, but she was in tears. And I just said, that's it, I'm done. And the rock and roll story is that I threw all my cameras out the Charlotte Street Hotel window and they smashed in the street below. And I said, that's it, I'm done. But actually, I threw them on the bed. It was like a little hissy fit. But I discovered that day that the Charlotte Street Hotel has like the bounciest beds in London because they hit the bed and then bounced out the window, smashed in the street below. It was a kind of, rock and roll exit. I was also doing a lot of drugs and just involved in the whole kind of scene of it all. It was just a mess. So I moved down to Hastings, got a job in a bar, didn't tell anybody about my past life. I didn't want to tell anybody because people were always interested in, you met this person. I just didn't tell anybody about that past. And I was really sinking into a very deep depression and completely lost, and really reached a point where I couldn't really see much point in carrying on with life. And then it was a moment of meeting somebody. It was just a chance that somebody was in the bar and they had a son called Nick who has autism. And he's on the spectrum. He's very high autism, so he struggles to look after himself. He self-harms. He needed 24-hour care. And so they had carers living with him, but they were what you would call professional carers, nurses and trained professionals. They were like, it'd be really nice to have somebody spend a couple of hours with him because he loves music. He's 18 at the time. He loves music, interested in all these other things. Would you just come and spend a couple of hours with him? And I thought, yeah, maybe that would be a good thing for me to do. And within a few weeks, I was his full-time carer and I was a live-in carer. And for the next 2 years of my life, that's what I did. And I think I learned in that moment that when I could see no purpose in my own life, my purpose was to support somebody else in theirs. And I always say me and Nick are still friends. Many years later, he always comes to my exhibition openings. And I always say we helped each other out at that time.
That's such a lovely way to look at that.
Yeah. And so we were a support network. And in brief, though, what happened at the end of that is after 2 years, he was struggling to communicate. He is verbal, but struggles to communicate. But he was very eloquent. I remember him describing his autism as like being at an amazing party where everyone's in the kitchen, but you're stuck in the basement and you don't know how to get upstairs to join them. And he had this very descriptive way. And we thought, why don't we make photographs of your life? And we can then show the psychologists and healthcare professionals and see if you'll get the support you needed. And so we did that. And even once he allowed me to photograph him when he'd been self-harming and there's kind of blood streaming down his face. And when we showed it to these psychologists and healthcare professionals that had accused his mother of over-exaggerating how bad his situation was, you saw them suddenly change. There was this evidence in front of them of, wow, this is the reality. And that was the moment I went, wow, that's what I can do with my camera. I can be an advocate for people. I can help them to tell their stories, to be almost like the evidence of them and to work with them to share their stories. And so that was the moment. It was actually a friend that bought me the camera to do it again. And that was when I decided this is what I was going to do with my life, is rather than spending my life with my own ego and the egos of all the celebrities, it was about taking the ego out of it and using the camera as a storyteller. I always hate that expression, to give people voice. We don't give people voice. We amplify their voices. We help them to be heard and to tell their stories. And that was the moment when I realized that was what I needed to do with my life.
You're so eloquent. You're a fantastic writer. I get a lot of pleasure out of the posts actually you put on Instagram because the subtleties in your language, when I use that word empowering, and that's not quite right. You're a beautiful wordsmith, I think. Am I right in thinking it was your godfather who gave you an Olympus when you were 18? And we've mentioned Catherine Fairweather, who's married to the legendary war photographer Don McCullin, a book of Don McCullin's. Was that part of your inspiration all those years ago as a teenager?
Yeah, it was a huge part. And it's funny you say about language. I'm dyslexic. And actually, I was always told I was stupid at school and I was held back a year. When you're like 13 years old and held back a year is the most humiliating thing you can imagine because everyone makes fun of you. It was really always a struggle for me. And so when I was 18, I was actually in the States on a sports scholarship and then had a car accident, came back, was in hospital, didn't know what I was going to do with my life. And my godfather passed away. But the week that he died, he'd bought these two things. One was Don McCullin's autobiography and another was an Olympus OM10 camera. So his widow, Nita, came to visit me and she said, well, you should have these two things. And I always say it's like we never know the impact we have on others, how two small gifts absolutely changed the destiny in my life because I'd never really thought about photography. And I looked through Don's book. I think I may be wrong in saying this, but I think he is dyslexic. But I know he struggled at school and he found the camera. And I was like, maybe this is my voice. And I started taking photographs and just absolutely fell in love with it. So yeah, I was absolutely inspired by reading Don's biography, but most specifically by just seeing some of his photographs that I'd never really seen images. And to this day, I think there's no other war photographer that I know that manages to make it feel so personal. My work is not really war because I'm not having pictures of people firing guns, but he has this ability that even in the middle of a fight in Hue in Vietnam, you're still looking into people's eyes. I don't know how it's even possible. I don't think anyone else has ever done it, but it haunted me. And I always think that's how I describe his imagery to me. It haunted me. And that's an incredibly powerful thing where you think, how can a photograph really haunt me? And to this day, some of those first photographs I saw of his still are like shadows. They're these things that watch over you and you're haunted by people's faces. And I thought, wow, what power to be able to do that with an image. But yeah, that was a huge inspiration of wanting to do that. But then, as I say, ended up getting caught up in the rock and roll life, which I don't regret. It was an amazing experience and also taught me a lot about editorial photography, how to plan things for magazines. It made me see things in maybe a different creative way.
Just before we leave that kind of rock and roll time, obviously you left it at one point, but who, either band-wise or musician-wise, who was your favourite person or band to photograph? Which memory do you really hold dear from those days?
I'll be honest, sometimes I see pictures in magazines with my credit and I don't even remember being there. It was the rock and roll years.
So you were living the rock and roll years.
Yeah. I remember doing a shoot with this band called Reef and they put me on the road with them for a week. And I came back and it was still in the days of film and And the editor gone through all the film and he calls me over. He goes, Giles, he goes, there's one picture in focus and that's of you. So yeah, it was very rock and roll. But I always think photography is like this passport into other people's lives and into history. So whether it be right now, I'm here in Ukraine, I've experienced a lot of things that people just see on the news. And in the same way, I was there when Oasis played Nebworth because I'm on the tour bus with them. And I'm all these amazing moments that I now have my nephews go, oh my God, I can't believe you were there. At the time, you don't really understand that. But it was just amazing. So a lot of it, I have fond memories of it. But I'm still working with Massive Attack and I still friends with PJ Harvey. And I think there were two bands that had huge impact on me at the time. And I still have great relationships with a lot of the musicians and bands and still feel that ties in with the work I do now.
It's still part of who you are, isn't it? You set up the Legacy of War Foundation, I think it was 2017, 6 years after the IED explosion in Afghanistan. Do you mind, Giles, if I ask you what happened? Because I know you have a very strong recollection, don't you, of what happened when you were out on that assignment in Afghanistan?
Yeah, first off, I would say I wasn't on assignment. I was there because I never do commissions, which it's important just because I was there purely doing my own projects, which means I had no support afterwards. So I got no payouts. I got no support whatsoever after it happened, which is an important distinction because unfortunately, increasingly, most photographers are freelance photographers. There's a lot of young photographers I see here in Ukraine who don't have health insurance, who don't have medical insurance because they simply can't afford it on the small amounts of money they get as freelance photographers. And a lot of newspapers and magazines have realized it's much better rather than having staff photographers, you have freelancers. Yeah. That is an important distinction to make because I say, unfortunately, I would say 95% of photographers working in conflict zones now don't have contracts. They're not under assignment, which means they're not protected if something happens to them.
Makes them very vulnerable, doesn't it? If anything does happen.
Yeah.
Who were you photographing at the time?
So I was working on a project about the impact of war on civilians. And so I was working with an Italian NGO called Emergency and was documenting their hospital in Kabul. But as part of that story, I then also became interested in that at that time, more American soldiers were killing themselves than were dying in combat. And really? So I was like, there's a story here as well about the psychological impact on these young boys, essentially, that are coming from Boise, Idaho, or wherever in mid-America, coming to Afghanistan. And once they'd gone through a few tours there was this incredibly high suicide rate. And I wanted to understand that. So that was the story I was doing. I was embedded with a group of 101st Airborne, the famous kind of band of brothers. And I would say it was a bad day at the office. So it's just one of those things that happens. I don't really like talking about it in a huge amount because I think sometimes this notion of war photographers that we put ourselves in danger, that we're all this adrenaline, etc. And I'm not like that at all. And it just happened to be, I really do think of it as a bad day at the office. It's a Formula One racing car driver. If they have an accident, nobody says, oh, they had a car accident. No, they were doing what they knew could cause harm. So yeah, it was one of those things. It happens. I stepped on an IED when we were on patrol. We'd been ambushed and pushed into a certain area where the Taliban had planted these IEDs, and unfortunately, one hit me. And as you said, I didn't lose my consciousness. I remember lying under a tree. Both my legs are gone. My left arm was mangled. I think the worst moment was because when something like that happens, everybody on the patrol has to call out their name. And it's because everyone's lying under cover because you're under fire potentially still, and you don't know what else is around. So everyone's laying down, making sure the area is safe. So everybody calls out their name so they can see who doesn't call their name out. And when I was always last because I was the photographer on top of the patrol. And I remember then trying to say my name and nothing coming out. I think that was the moment where it really just hit me that, am I dying? Am I done? And then you have to wait for them to clear the area, get to you. And in fact, I remember one of the soldiers looking over and just saying, oh my God, which was not a very kind of reassuring comment.
Not what you want to hear.
But then Chris Metz, who was the sergeant leading the patrol, he put the tourniquets on me. And actually, I remember he was even feeding me a cigarette as we watched the helicopters coming down the valley to pick me up. It was very cinematic in many ways. And at the time, I just thought, I'm not going to survive this, but I can keep going for a minute, keep going for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And then I was picked up by the Medivac helicopter. I remember the two guys, CJ and Phil, who were the two medics fighting to save my life, the conversations we had. In fact, they had helmet cam footage. So I remember watching the footage probably a year later and having these conversations. And by the time we reached Kandahar, I was going, am I going to live? And they're like, hell yeah. And we love you. And it was the bond. It's very hard to explain. You spend with people that you think will be the last moments of your life. And we're still in contact to this day with those medics. But yeah, miraculous that I survived. I never like people saying anything about my survival in terms of you must have been really strong or you must have been, because the ones that don't make it are just as strong as me and just as whatever it was, a bit of mud that got stuck in a vein or whatever my luck was that day that stopped me dying. It was luck. But the thing that I find more interesting is what happened then afterwards, because then I was put into an induced coma, flown back to the United Kingdom, went to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, which is where I regained consciousness. And when I regained consciousness, I was in an intensive care unit, which is bright white lights, no windows, clocks, people rushing around, bleeps, alarms going off. And I did what anybody would probably want to do, which is to scream or shout or let people know you're awake again. And I realized nothing came out of my mouth because I had tubes in my throat. There was no way I could speak. I tried to move my remaining hand, but it was in a plaster cast and strapped to the bed. I soon realized the only thing I could do was to blink. And I had no other bodily function. I couldn't even control when I went to the toilet. I was fed through a tube. The only thing I had any control over was blinking. And that was pretty much the case the next 46 days. And that, I think, is the bit psychologically that I think is really interesting. I always say that's the forge that made my metal. Quite literally, that's the forge that made me who I am. Because at first you feel like you're in a kind of, thrown in the ocean. You want to panic, you want to scream, your breath's been taken away. But then I realized I'm stuck here for a while and I'm going to have to work out some kind of system in my own brain to keep myself sane. Because at that point, obviously I had no idea how long I'd be there. The very fact that you're in intensive care means you might die at any time. They're trying to fight to keep you alive. Sometimes I'd be put into a coma, sometimes out of it. It was all a big blur. But really, my only communication was within myself. I don't know if you've ever read, actually, there's the book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which is about...
And seen the film.
Yeah, and the French editor had locked-in syndrome. And ironically, I'd given it actually to my girlfriend at the time, the week before I went to Afghanistan. And I woke up with that same thing of unable to communicate. And I always joke that the film is very beautiful. And the linguist who helps him to write his book through blinking develops an alphabet where it's the most used letters at the beginning. It's a very romantic, beautiful French film. And I had the NHS equivalent, which was like, I had this little bit of paper, which I couldn't read because it turned out later I still had my contact lenses in for 2 months. So I couldn't read, everything was blurred. I remember I had this big coffee stain on it, and the poor nurses, who were brilliant, they were just absolutely the best, but they were rushed off their feet. So we'd be trying to point to these different letters that I couldn't really read. I'd blink. Then somebody would shout something at them. They'd have to turn around. Then they'd be like, oh, I can't remember where we were, what we were doing. It was just impossible to communicate that way. And twice my family was called in to say goodbye. And I remember my sister sitting by my bed and just saying her goodbyes to me because they said there's no way I could make it. And all I could do was blink.
But you created this incredible world in your own mind, didn't you? And very interesting thoughts about photography you still wanted to do. Tell us about that.
I did 100 portraits before I die, which was one project, which was just thinking about the people I wished I'd done portraits of and then visualizing those photo shoots, whether I shot color, black and white, film, digital, studio, location, how I'd greet the people, and then I'd critique it at the end and then think I could do differently next time. But actually the one I don't think I've mentioned this many times to people, but the other one I did was food. And actually I became a chef when I was locked down because I would visualize each meal I'd had and then go through it and imagine those really important meals in your life. And it might even just be like the egg, chips and mushrooms that my mum cooked for me when I was a kid, or the first time I had this amazing pasta in Sicily. And then I would just spend hours trying to taste it again and go through it in my mind and think, well, what was in it? What was that flavor? What was that? What was that? And that's really how I learned to cook. Both with the photography and the cooking, it just shows that when we have our creativity and our imagination, we can never truly be locked out.
And do you think that was the inspiration perhaps then for the One-Armed Chef and the series that you did?
Yeah, absolutely.
And heading off and cooking in all these incredible places.
Yeah, absolutely. So I now, when I'm cooking, I have learned this way of my brain working. I can't remember what the figure is, but it's something ridiculous, like the amount of our brain that we don't use for things. And I think I developed parts of my brain that maybe we don't use because I had to find my own little universe in my brain. So when it comes to food, I definitely now have a way of, if I taste something, thinking about it in a way that I didn't before I was in that sort of coma period. I learned really the power of the human mind and the power of our creativity and our imagination when we still will always have that freedom.
I think you were quoted as saying that the hardest time was back in your bed sitting Clapham and the phone not ringing because colleagues had said, oh, you'll be back and we're working, etc. How did you get through that time and what was it that got you through to start work again? Because you started traveling really very quickly.
Yeah, I started traveling the first trip to Afghanistan, but that was with Channel 4 also, was supporting that and filming it. And so I went back there and we did that. And it was actually after that. So that was 18 months after my injury. It was actually after that when I came back and I was thinking, now I've shown people I can work again. The pictures were published, etc. Now surely things will happen. and nothing did. And I just realized that nothing was ever going to come my way. And to this day, nobody ever offers me commissions. I think there's an unconscious bias that people have. And I've actually called out a couple of people about this now, and they both admit it. And these 2 picture editors, that they actually felt really terrible about it, but it was important for me to understand it. And all of us carry an unconscious bias. And so when a picture editor is sitting there thinking, oh, what photographer I want to take for this project, if my name comes up, immediately they think there's going to be more work. It's going to be harder because he has a disability. Surely that's going to be a challenge. Without even thinking about it, that happens in the processing of people's minds. So the only time I ever get asked to do a photograph, which I don't do, but if it's around soldiers with amputations or something Paralympics or something that people think associate with my work. So I realized anyway that nobody was going to help me out of this situation. And one of the turning points, I was really, as I say, this bedsit was really grim. It had like mold on the walls. I had to leave my wheelchair outside it. It was so small. And I didn't have many visitors because people obviously had spent a lot of time when I was in hospital. It was a really dark time. My fiance left me. It was just like, you name it. There was nothing much to hold on to in terms of positivity. And I was asked to go and speak at a conference for journalists in South Africa. And I'd said yes. And then when it came to it, I wasn't going to go. And then my brother, he drove all the way up to London. He lived down in Somerset, packed my suitcase, took me to the airport and pretty much pushed me on the plane. And I was drinking a lot again there and just like really lost. Then I got to South Africa and I spoke at this conference. But what was more important is I met a lot of other journalists who had been persecuted in different ways. So there's a couple of journalists from Syria, from Yemen, many who had been tortured. It was a conference bringing journalists together from the world. And also I met journalists that have been involved in the anti-apartheid movement and sitting with people who really risked their lives, who'd been beaten, who'd been tortured to do their work. Actually made me realize I'd been a bit self-indulgent and that it was time for me to get my shit together and find a way to get working again. So I went back to the UK and then started just reaching out to organizations and then actually start self-funding my work and just decided, look, if nobody's going to give you the work, then find a way to do it. And actually that's changed my whole approach and actually given me so much more freedom because now all my work is self-assigned and all my work is self-funded. And I have individuals and businesses who just see the value in my work. And there's one company, Travel Age, where I'm a explorer in residence, which I love that title, but they understand that there's a value to the work that I'm doing. And so they fund it independently, which gives me the freedom to do stories the way that I think is right. And a good example of that is a story I did on a young girl. One of the first things I did after I returned to work was a young girl called Khwala in Lebanon. She was 12 years old at the time. I was documenting a family near her in these sort of tents that were homemade tents, really dire situation for these families. And she kept coming around going, photograph me. She wanted to tell me her story. But I could see she was so vulnerable. She was so weak and vulnerable. And I took a photograph of her with the sun behind her so you can't see her face or anything. But then I said to her, I'm going to come back and you can tell me your story when I think you're ready. And actually, I didn't know what had happened to her. And basically, in Syria, a missile hit her school and she's seen most of her friends killed. Then when they escaped and crossed the border, her father was abducted. And then she was living in these homemade tents with her mother and her 2 brothers who have disability. And she had heard her mother saying she was struggling to feed everybody. So she had taken rat poison, thinking that if she killed herself, her brothers would get more food. And she had survived, but was incredibly weak. And so she was so vulnerable. Now, if I was working for a magazine, and I actually remember somebody from a newspaper who I was a friend, I was telling a story, and they're like, oh my God, we got to do that story. And I said, no, it's not right. It doesn't feel right. So actually, she was 12 then. I went back and did her story when she was 18. On her 18th birthday, I took her out. We went out and had pizza, and I said, now you can tell me your story. Now, that's how I feel I've always wanted to work. I can only do that because I work in this independent way. But what I was able to do in the meantime is my foundation was able to rehouse her and her mother and her 2 brothers and get her educated until she was 18. I realized when I set out to make photographs, I was not really wanting to be on the cover of New York Times. I always say I was not a photojournalist, but an angry man with a camera. I wanted to create change. And then I realized that meant I didn't always have to make photographs. I didn't have to do these things because if my purpose was to try and help somebody like Khwala, if I could do that without making a photograph, why make the photograph? Why do the story? So we were able to help her. And then, as I say, at 18, we sit down and we do the interview. So I'm very privileged that I've managed to carve this little path that actually came because of people not giving me work again after my injury. It came because of maybe the prejudices, unconscious biases that many people with disability have to deal with. That gave me the opportunity to work in a way that I'm really proud to work in and a way that gives me the freedom to do things the way I think they should be done.
It's wonderful that you've managed to carve this path. Just leave us with a sense, if you would, Giles, of what's happening in Ukraine at the minute and some of the projects you're doing. You mentioned the ambulances.
Ukraine, as I say, is a place very close to my heart. I spent a lot of time here over the years. It's hard because, in fact, Ukrainian friends are always saying to me, what do you think will happen? What's going to be the end result? And I always say I'm not going to get into those conversations because it's all speculation. Anybody that tells you they know what's going to happen is a liar because nobody knows. What I know is all the individual personal stories. And again, throughout this whole conversation, I've kept telling it's all about those individual stories. And we respond to those stories. And just a week ago, I was in Kherson, which is near where the front is. It was an area that was occupied by the Russians and then liberated, but is under threat again. And I met a woman there who's 27 years old, and she had to travel because her village had been occupied, then she'd escaped, then to another village was occupied. She was finding another village, which is still under threat. You can hear artillery still in the background. And she'd had a very difficult childhood. Her mother was an alcoholic, and she'd basically been brought up by her grandmother. But she met a soldier and they fell in love, and she became pregnant. And so they traveled to get a scan done. But because 1,600 healthcare facilities have been destroyed here in Ukraine by the Russians, so there's very little local healthcare facilities. So she had to travel to Kherson, which is quite dangerous, to get the scan done of her baby. And on the way back, she's there with her other daughter, who's 12 years old, and they're all excited. And they had a puncture and they stopped at a garage, and a missile hit the garage. And she was dragged out of the car. There was chaos everywhere. There was a lot of people injured. And she was lying on the grass next to this cafe that was on fire. And she was recounting to me how she could hear there was a young soldier inside that they couldn't get out. And she heard him burning to death, essentially. And his last words, he was trying to speak to her. And in fact, later, his family came to find her to find out what he had said in his last moments. But she was lying there listening to this, but also realized that she was bleeding and that her baby had died inside her, and she had back injury. I met her, and she's already back at work because she has to look after her child, and her husband now is at the front line fighting. She has to support her grandmother. And there's a perfect example of, she's so positive, so strong. She's only 27 years old, holding her whole family together. She's gone through this incredible trauma of losing a child on the day which should have been such a happy day. She showed me the picture of the scan that they just got from the hospital. And she just wants to live her life in peace and just to carry on. And the area is under threat again of occupation. She'll probably be forced again into another village where they'll have to try and rent a room and try and find a way to survive. What we're doing is providing new vehicles which will provide primary healthcare for women in these frontline areas, because it's one of the things that there's always a lot of focus on the military casualties, which of course is vitally important. But when you have all the healthcare facilities destroyed, it means the primary healthcare, and because there's mainly women left in those communities, disappears. So things like smear tests, normal gynecological tests don't happen. And so it's often too late by the time that people look for treatment. And so a woman like that who had to travel into the more dangerous areas just to get a scan, we're having vehicles that provide scans. Now, I say that story, I know that doesn't tell you the whole of what's happening in Ukraine, but what it does tell you is there's just one story of one family. And there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of families across Ukraine who have lost loved ones fighting on the front, who have been displaced, who live under constant threat of occupation, who are under occupation. And people are exhausted and tired, but they're also the most resilient nation I know. I was with a unit near the front line that was exhuming bodies. They bring back bodies from the front line to identify them. And when they were exhuming those bodies, they found other bones, and they realized that those were people from World War II. And you realize that Ukraine is like layer after layer of suffering from war. They suffered more than any other nation in World War II. Between 1930 and 1945, 1 in 4 Ukrainians died, either due to the Holodomor or the war or the Holocaust. And so this nation has suffered so much to get its freedom, and its generational resilience, this incredible power. And we've talked a lot about words and the use of words. Resilience is another word I hate, because I would say if you meet somebody who's resilient, it means they suffered. It means they've gone through something really difficult. I remember when COVID hit, I had a lot of companies reach out to me and say, Giles, you're the most resilient person we know. Come and give us a talk about being more resilient. We need to be more resilient. And I would say, no, I can't. And they were like, what do you mean? I said, I don't believe you can make yourself more resilient. They'd be like, no, but I heard a podcast and there's a book I picked up at the airport. And I would say, no, they're all bullshit. I said, I believe resilience is life's gift for suffering. that each challenge we face in our life gives us that resilience. It's like the elasticity of our mind is stretched by those experiences, and that builds resilience. That means we cope with things in a different way the next time. And that deep resilience comes from the really traumatic experiences. And so what I find in Ukraine is this deep resilience that is both generational, because many have got parents, grandparents that have had to go through terrible conflicts. They're an incredible nation. I will stand here with them and support them till the last, until victory comes. But what's important is to remember that they're just everyday people generally on those frontline areas who just want to live their life in peace, to bring up their kids, to look after their loved ones, to get educated, to do businesses, whatever it is. And we have to find ways to give them that freedom to carry on.
I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. Is there any way that we can see some of your work soon, Giles? Do you have any exhibitions coming up? And how, if people are listening to this and want to try and help and perhaps help with some funding, how can they help you?
Legacy of War Foundation. If you look that up, legacyofwarfoundation.com, there you will see more about the foundation, the work we do. And as I say, one of the things that's really important is we make sure that the funding gets to the people. So it's either assets or education. We don't have offices. We don't have international staff. We make sure it goes to the people that you donate to. And then if you want to see more about my photographic work, these days, of course, Instagram seems to be the way to follow a lot of people's creativity. But also I have a website with a lot of my work on, which is both film, writing, and photography, and that's gilesduley.com.
gilesduley.com. Giles, thank you so much. I'm sure I can say without doubt that you have a busy afternoon ahead. So thank you for taking a break, having a quick coffee and sharing some of your story with us. And when you're back in the UK, it'd be lovely to have some supper or something and work out if there's anything that I can do in any small way to help what you're doing. I really am in awe of what you're doing in the foundation. It's incredible. Please keep going with it.
Thank you for taking the time. I always say that the stories have no value if people don't hear them. And I've realized over time that I'm not a photographer, a writer, a chef. I am a storyteller. And it's having a platform like this to be able to share those stories that I really appreciate.
I'm a storyteller too, and so was my dad for 46 years. So it's been a pleasure. And Catherine, if you're listening, thank you for so generously introducing me to Giles. You've been listening to Giles Duley, founder of the Legacy of War Foundation, humanitarian, an extraordinary photographer, extraordinary man. If you'd like to help, do check out the Legacy of War Foundation's website. Don't forget to subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com or search the Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with another great guest. See you then.